You're in the wrong seat, sweetheart." The words sliced through the first-class cabin of Flight 847 like a blade through silk. They weren't spoken quietly. They weren't whispered with embarrassment. They were delivered with the confident authority of a man who believed the world bent to his will. Richard Blackwood, CEO of Data Flow Systems, stood in the aisle of the Boeing 777's premium cabin, his $5,000 suit pressed to perfection, his platinum card still visible in his manicured fingers. He was staring down at seat 2A, where a young black woman sat quietly wearing a faded gray hoodie and beat-up sneakers that looked like they'd walked through a war zone. She didn't look up. She had earbuds and cheap wired ones and was scrolling through a phone with a cracked screen. Her backpack, worn and patched, sat on the tray table like it owned the place. Richard felt his jaw tighten. This was first class. This was his sanctuary. This was where people like him belonged, not scholarship kids who'd clearly gotten lucky with some computer glitch or employee favor. What Richard Blackwood didn't know was that in exactly 45 minutes, the girl he was about to humiliate would destroy his entire world. She wouldn't raise her voice. She wouldn't fight back with fists. She would simply reveal who she really was, and that revelation would cost him everything he'd spent his life building. Before we dive into this story, tell me where you're watching from. Comment your city below. And if you've ever been judged by your appearance, hit that subscribe button because this story is for you. The air inside the first-class cabin smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Richard had paid $15,000 for his seat to Geneva, where he was flying to finalize the acquisition that would make Data Flow Systems a global powerhouse. He needed everything to be perfect. He needed the silence, the space, and the assurance that he was surrounded by his own kind. But as he settled into seat 1A and glanced across the aisle, perfection shattered. The girl in 2A couldn't have been older than 19. Her dark skin contrasted sharply with the pristine white leather of the seat. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun secured with what looked like a rubber band. She was unwrapping a piece of gum, completely unbothered by the luxury surrounding her. Richard blinked, certain she was lost. Maybe she was a cleaner finishing up. Maybe she'd wandered from economy and gotten confused. But she was sitting there like she belonged, and that burned him from the inside out. He leaned across the aisle, his voice dripping with false politeness. "Excuse me, miss." "Nothing." The girl kept scrolling through her phone, earbuds firmly in place. Richard felt a familiar surge of irritation. He wasn't used to being ignored. In his world, people jumped when he spoke. He snapped his fingers twice sharp and demanding, "Hey! Hello!" This time she looked up. Her eyes were dark-tired and completely unimpressed. She pulled one earbud out with deliberate slowness. "Yeah." Her voice was calm, slightly raspy with the tone of someone who'd heard this conversation before. "You're in the wrong seat," Richard said, gesturing vaguely toward the back of the plane. "Economy boarding is that way. You need to move before you block the aisle for real passengers." The girl stared at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the seat number displayed on the wall of her pod. Then back at him. Her expression didn't change. "I'm in 2A, she said simply. "You're in whatever you are." "We're good." She started to put the earbud back in. Richard's mouth fell open. The audacity was breathtaking. The complete lack of respect made his blood pressure spike. "Listen," he said, standing up fully now, his voice carrying across the cabin. "I don't know how you got that seat, but first class isn't for people like you. There's been some kind of mistake." Now other passengers were looking. An older Hispanic woman in 1B lowered her magazine. A business traveler in 3C glanced up from his laptop. "People like me," the girl repeated, her voice still calm but with an edge that could cut glass. "You know what I mean," Richard said, his confidence growing as he felt the eyes of the cabin on him. "Look at yourself. Look around. You don't fit." That's when Miguel Santos, the flight attendant, approached with practiced diplomatic grace. "Is everything all right here?" Miguel asked, his accent slight, but his professionalism absolute. "Yes," Richard said immediately. "There's a situation. This girl is obviously in the wrong seat. She needs to be moved back to coach where she belongs." Miguel glanced at the girl, then back at Richard. "Sir, Miss Williams is a ticketed passenger in seat 2A. I've already verified her boarding pass. Miss Williams." Richard laughed, the sound sharp and ugly. "What did she do? Win a contest? Use miles from her job at McDonald's?" The girl finally pulled both earbuds out. She looked directly at Richard, her gaze steady and unblinking. "My name is Kendra Williams," she said quietly. "And you're about to learn why judging people by their clothes is the stupidest mistake you can make." Richard Blackwood was a man who believed in optimization. At 45, he had built data flow systems from a small consulting firm into a $2 billion empire that managed data infrastructure for half the Fortune 500. His philosophy was simple. Everything and everyone had a place, and when things were out of place, you fixed them. He wore his success like armor. The Brioni suits the Patek Philippe watched the Italian leather shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. These weren't just accessories. They were weapons in a war he'd been fighting since childhood, when he'd grown up as the son of a middle manager in Detroit, watching his father bow and scrape to men who looked down on him. Richard had sworn he'd never bow to anyone again. He'd climbed every ladder, stepped on every throat, and crushed every obstacle that stood between him and the top of the world. Now, flying to Geneva to acquire a European data firm that would make him untouchable, he needed everything to be perfect. "I optimize environments," he often told his executives. "If something doesn't fit, I remove it." The girl in 2A definitely didn't fit. Kendra Williams looked like exactly what Richard assumed she was, a scholarship kid who'd gotten lucky. Her hoodie was faded from too many washes. Her sneakers had holes near the big toes. Her backpack looked like it had survived high school and then some. But appearances, as Richard was about to learn, could be devastatingly deceiving. At 19, Kendra was already one of the most important people in America. She held dual PhDs from MIT in computer science and advanced mathematics, earned by the time most kids were graduating high school. For the past 3 years, she'd been the Department of Defense's secret weapon against cyber warfare. The algorithms in her worn backpack had already prevented 2 major attacks on American infrastructure. The code she was currently working on would protect the global banking system from a coordinated assault that intelligence agencies had been tracking for months. She chose to work in the shadows, avoiding publicity and recognition. "I'm more effective when people underestimate me," she'd told her handler at the NSA. "Let them see a teenager in a hoodie. They never see the genius coming." The irony wasn't lost on her that the very prejudice that hurt people who looked like her had become her greatest professional asset. When enemy agents were looking for a cybersecurity expert, they searched for middle-aged white men in expensive suits. They never looked twice at a tired black girl with a backpack. Right now, she was exhausted. She'd been working 80-hour weeks for 2 months straight, racing to complete the defense protocols that would launch in Geneva. All she wanted was 8 hours of peace at 35,000 feet before she had to save the world again. But the man in 1A apparently had other plans. Agent Carlos Torres sat in seat 3C pretending to read a business magazine while monitoring every word of the conversation developing across the aisle. At 44, Torres was a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Marshals Service specializing in protecting high-value federal assets. Protecting Kendra Williams wasn't just his job, it was his honor. He'd watched her work, seen her solve problems that stumped teams of experts 3 times her age. She was brilliant, dedicated, and completely unpretentious, despite being one of the most valuable minds in the country. He also knew she could take care of herself. The girl had trained with military combat instructors since she was 16. Her reflexes were faster than most Navy SEALs. But Torres was there as backup, watching for threats that might emerge from unexpected directions, like racist CEOs with anger management issues. Miguel Santos had been a flight attendant for 8 years, and he'd seen every kind of passenger drama imaginable. Rich people who demanded special treatment, celebrities who wanted to be invisible, politicians who needed extra security. But he'd rarely seen anything as ugly as what was unfolding in the first-class cabin of Flight 847. The man in 1A was clearly looking for a fight, and the young woman in 2A was clearly trying to avoid one. Miguel believed in treating every passenger with equal respect regardless of their appearance or apparent wealth. It was a philosophy that had served him well, earning him commendations from the airline and genuine appreciation from travelers who remembered being treated like human beings instead of cargo. He could see this situation was about to escalate, and he was determined to prevent it. Elena Rodriguez occupied seat 1B directly behind Richard Blackwood, and she'd been watching the interaction with growing disgust. At 52, Elena was the chief operations officer of a major construction firm in Miami. She'd built her career in a male-dominated industry by working twice as hard and taking no prisoners. She'd also experienced her share of discrimination. As a Latina woman in corporate America, she'd been underestimated, dismissed, and talked over more times than she could count. She recognized the look in the young woman's eyes because she'd seen it in her own mirror too many times. Elena pulled out her phone and quietly started recording. Whatever was about to happen, she wanted evidence. Richard Blackwood was not a man who backed down from conflict. If anything, confrontation energized him. It reminded him of his corporate raids, his hostile takeovers, the moments when he'd walked into boardrooms and systematically dismantled his competition. This was just another hostile takeover, except instead of acquiring a company, he was reclaiming his rightful environment. He turned away from Miguel and focused back on Kendra. "Look, I don't care what her ticket says. I paid $15,000 for this seat specifically because first class maintains certain standards. I have important work to do and I can't have distractions." "What kind of distractions?" Kendra asked, her voice still calm, but with an undercurrent of something sharper. "You know exactly what I mean," Richard said. "The music, the gum popping, the constant phone activity. I need a professional environment." Kendra hadn't been playing music. She hadn't popped her gum once. Her phone had been silent. Sir Miguel interjected. "Miss Williams has been completely quiet during boarding. She hasn't disturbed anyone." Yet Richard said, "Look, Miguel, I know you're trying to be diplomatic, but let's be realistic. Does she look like she belongs in first class? Does she look like someone who can afford a $15,000 ticket?" Miguel's expression tightened. "Sir, I cannot and will not judge passengers based on their appearance. Miss Williams has every right to be here." Richard felt his frustration building. Why was everyone protecting this obvious fraud? Why couldn't they see what he saw so clearly? He pulled out his phone and opened his text messages, typing rapidly to his VP of operations, stuck next to charity case in first class. "Airlines have zero standards anymore. This is why I need to buy my own jet." Kendra watched him type, her expression unreadable. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a thick leather-bound notebook. It looked ancient, like something a medieval scholar might have used, completely out of place with her modern hoodie and sneakers. She opened it, revealing pages covered in dense mathematical equations, numbers, symbols, and formulas that looked like they belonged in a graduate-level physics course, not in the hands of a teenager. Richard glanced over and felt a moment of confusion. What was a scholarship kid doing with advanced calculus? Why did those equations look so complex? He shook off the doubt. Probably homework she was cheating on. Maybe she'd stolen the notebook from someone smarter. "Is that your homework?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Kendra looked up from her work. Something like that. What subject? Remedial math. Elena Rodriguez, who had been listening to the entire exchange, finally spoke up. "Sir, would you please leave that young woman alone?" She's not bothering anyone. Richard turned to face Elena, his smile sharp and predatory. Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but I'm simply ensuring that first class maintains its standards. We pay premium prices for a premium experience. The only thing ruining my premium experience, Elena said coolly, is your voice. Richard's face flushed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by women. Look, I don't know what kind of bleeding heart nonsense you subscribe to, but reality is reality. That girl doesn't belong here. Why, Elena pressed. Because she's black, because she's young, because she's not wearing a $1,000 suit, because she's obviously using a stolen credit card or some kind of airline employee favor, Richard snapped. Normal people don't just end up in first class by accident. Normal people like you? Kendra asked quietly. Richard turned back to her, surprised by the question. Exactly like me. I built a billion-dollar company from nothing. I earned this seat. And what makes you think I didn't earn mine? Look at you, Richard said, gesturing to her outfit. I've been studying people my entire career. I know success when I see it, and I know failure when I see it. You're wearing shoes that cost less than my socks. Kendra closed her notebook with a soft snap. She looked at Richard for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face like she was reading a book. You know, she said, finally, I've met a lot of people who mistake expensive clothes for expensive thoughts. The correlation isn't as strong as you think. Richard felt a flicker of something uncomfortable in his chest. The girl was articulate, too articulate for his mental image of her. Where did you go to school? He asked suddenly. Does it matter? Humor me. M.I.T., Kendra said simply. Richard laughed. Right. And I went to Mars. Come on, be serious. Elena leaned forward in her seat. You know what I believe her. She sounds a hell of a lot smarter than you do. That was the final straw. Richard stood up abruptly, his full height towering over Kendra's seated form. His voice rose to a level that made every passenger in the first-class cabin look up. This is ridiculous. Miguel, I want to see her boarding pass, her ID, and her credit card. I want proof that she's not defrauding this airline. Sir, Miguel said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I cannot ask a passenger to produce documentation for another passenger's satisfaction. That's not how this works. Then I'll ask her myself, Richard said, turning to Kendra. Show me your boarding pass. Show me how you paid for this seat. Kendra looked up at him, completely unintimidated by his looming presence. No. What do you mean no? I mean no. I won't show you anything. You're not the crew, you're not security, and you're definitely not in charge of me. Richard felt his control slipping. The girl was supposed to be intimidated. She was supposed to back down, apologize, maybe even voluntarily move to coach to avoid further embarrassment. Instead, she was staring at him like he was the one who didn't belong. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice was starting to whisper that maybe, just maybe, he was making a terrible mistake. The first-class cabin had become a theater, and every passenger was now an unwilling audience member in a drama that was spiraling out of control. Richard Blackwood paced the narrow aisle, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor with aggressive rhythm. He'd gone from annoyed to angry to genuinely enraged. This wasn't how his world was supposed to work. When he spoke, people listened. When he made demands, they were met. But Kendra Williams sat in her seat like a queen on a throne, completely unmoved by his fury. He pulled out his phone again, typing another message to his assistant research passenger manifest for Flight 847. Need to know how someone named Kendra Williams got first-class seat. Investigate possible employee theft or credit card fraud. Then he opened his Signal app and sent a message to his private investigator. Need background check. ASAP. Kendra Williams, approximately 19, black female claiming MIT education. Something's not right. Find out what she's hiding. Agent Torres watched from seat 3C, his muscles coiled and ready. He'd seen this kind of escalation before. Entitled men who couldn't accept that the world didn't revolve around them often became dangerous when their authority was challenged. His hand rested casually on his belt where his service weapon was concealed beneath his jacket. He hoped he wouldn't need it, but he was prepared for anything. Kendra continued working in her notebook, her pen moving with fluid precision across equations that would have impressed professors at MIT. She appeared completely absorbed in her work, but Torres knew she was hyper-aware of everything happening around her. She'd been trained for situations like this. Not hostile passengers specifically, but situations where her cover might be blown, where her safety might be compromised. She knew exactly how to handle Richard Blackwood. The question was whether she'd need to. Miguel Santos approached Richard again, his diplomatic mask starting to slip. "Sir, I need to ask you to return to your seat. You're disturbing the entire cabin." "I'm disturbing the cabin." Richard's voice reached a pitch that made several passengers wince. She's the disturbance. She's the fraud. She's the one who doesn't belong, based on what evidence Elena called from her seat. Based on reality. Richard shot back. Based on common sense. Look at her and tell me she can afford a first-class ticket. "I'm looking at her," Elena said, "and I see a young woman minding her own business while you have a racist meltdown." "This isn't about race," Richard snarled. "This is about standards. This is about maintaining the integrity of first class." "No," said a new voice. "This is about you being a bigoted asshole." The voice belonged to Dr. James Mitchell, an older white passenger in seat 1D. He was a retired university professor flying to Geneva for an academic conference, and he'd been watching the entire exchange with growing disgust. "I've been listening to you for 20 minutes, Dr. Mitchell continued, "and everything you've said has been based on racist assumptions about that young woman's appearance and background. You should be ashamed of yourself." Richard felt surrounded. How had he become the villain? He was trying to protect the integrity of first class. He was standing up for standards. "Fine," he said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "If none of you will listen to reason, I'll get the proof myself." He moved toward Kendra's seat, reaching for her backpack on the tray table. That's when everything changed. Kendra's hand shot out faster than anyone could track, grabbing Richard's wrist in a grip that made him gasp in pain. Her movement was so fluid, so precise that it looked like a dance move rather than a defensive technique. "Don't," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new authority that made the entire cabin go silent. "Touch my bag." She released his wrist and he stumbled backward, rubbing the spot where her fingers had been. The pain was sharp and immediate, but what shocked him more was the casual ease with which she'd handled him. "Did you see that?" he shouted, looking around the cabin for support. "She assaulted me. She just committed assault. I saw a young woman defend her property from an aggressive stranger," Elena said coolly. "I saw a man try to steal someone's bag," added Dr. Mitchell. Agent Torres stood up slowly, his imposing frame unfolding from seat 3C. He was a large man, built like a linebacker, with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. "Problem, Miss Williams?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. Kendra glanced at him and shook her head slightly. "Just a pest, Agent Torres. Nothing I can't handle." Richard froze. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. "Agent Torres." Miss Williams had just called the man in 3C Agent Torres. "You know him?" Richard stammered, looking between Kendra and the imposing figure who was now standing in the aisle. "We work together," Kendra said simply. Richard felt his world starting to tilt on its axis, the notebook full of complex equations, The calm confidence under pressure. The way she disarmed him so easily. The federal agent who apparently knew her by name. "Who are you?" he whispered. Kendra Williams looked up at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than 19. Eyes that had seen things he couldn't imagine. Eyes that held secrets that could reshape his understanding of everything. "That," she said quietly, "is exactly the right question, Richard. Too bad you waited so long to ask it." Richard Blackwood's mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just heard. Agent Torres. Miss Williams had called the man in 3C Agent Torres like she knew him professionally, like they worked together. But that was impossible. She was just a kid, a scholarship student, a diversity admit who'd gotten lucky with a computer glitch. Wasn't she? "You're lying," Richard said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're both lying. This is some kind of scam. You're working together to intimidate passengers." Agent Torres took a step closer, his expression neutral, but his presence overwhelming. "Sir, I'm going to ask you once to return to your seat and leave Miss Williams alone." "I want to see your badge," Richard demanded, his desperation making him reckless. "If you're really an agent, prove it." Torres reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, pulling out a leather wallet that he flipped open to reveal a gold star badge and federal identification. "Deputy U.S. Marshal Carlos Torres." Satisfied, Richard stared at the badge, his mouth dry. A U.S. Marshal. On the plane. Protecting a teenager in a hoodie. None of this made sense. "What's a marshal doing on a commercial flight?" he asked. "My job," Torres said, simply closing the wallet and tucking it back into his jacket. Richard's paranoia kicked into overdrive. This was a setup. Had to be. Someone was trying to frame him or blackmail him or somehow compromise his business deal in Geneva. "This is about data flow, isn't it?" he said, backing toward his seat but keeping his eyes on Torres. "Someone paid you to sabotage my trip." "My competitors, probably. They know I'm flying to Geneva, so they plant a fake marshal and some actress to create a scene." Elena Rodriguez laughed from her seat, a sound of pure disbelief. "You think someone hired federal agents to mess with you, sir? You need therapy." "It makes perfect sense," Richard insisted, his voice getting louder again. "Corporate espionage happens every day. They plant this girl in first class knowing I'd complain, then bring in their fake marshal to make me look like the bad guy. Probably recording everything for social media." Kendra closed her notebook and looked at Richard with what might have been pity. "Richard, nobody needs to make you look bad. You're doing a fantastic job all by yourself. Don't play innocent with me," Richard snarled. "I know exactly what this is. You're probably not even American, are you? Probably some foreign agent sent to compromise American businessmen." The cabin went dead silent. Even the engine noise seemed to fade as passengers absorbed what Richard had just said. Dr. Mitchell shook his head slowly. "Son, you need to stop talking. Right now." But Richard was past the point of listening to advice. The conspiracy theory had taken hold in his mind, and it felt better than admitting he might be wrong about the girl in 2A. "Let me guess," he continued, pointing at Kendra. "You're here on some kind of student visa, right? Pretending to be American. Did they coach you on the MIT story, or was that improvised?" "I was born in Detroit," Kendra said quietly. "Graduated from Cass Technical High School at 14, MIT at 16. I've lived in America my entire life. Prove it." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Even Richard seemed to realize he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Agent Torres's expression hardened. "Mr. Blackwood, you just demanded an American citizen prove her citizenship based on her race. On a recorded flight. With witnesses." Richard's face went pale as the implications hit him. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I have a right to know who I'm sitting next to," he said weakly. "No," Torres said, "you don't. You have a right to sit in your seat and mind your own business. That's it. Miguel Santos, who had been trying to manage the situation diplomatically, finally lost his patience. Sir, if you cannot behave appropriately, I will have to report this incident to the captain. Report what I'm the victim here. I'm being intimidated by federal agents. You're being a racist piece of garbage, Elena said bluntly, and everyone on this plane can see it. Richard whirled to face her. How dare you call me racist? I employ dozens of minorities at Dataflow. I've donated to diversity programs. Congratulations, Elena replied dryly. You want a cookie? I am not a racist. Richard's voice cracked with emotion. I just believe in merit. I believe in earning your place. I worked my entire life to afford first class, and I deserve to know that other first-class passengers did the same. Kendra stood up slowly, her movement fluid and controlled. At her full height, she was smaller than Richard, but something about her presence made her seem larger. You want to know about merit? She asked, her voice calm but carrying a new edge. You want to know about earning your place? Yes, Richard said, though something in her tone made him nervous. I graduated summa cum laude from MIT with a 4.0 GPA. I published my first peer-reviewed paper on quantum encryption at 17. I hold 7 patents in cybersecurity that have generated over $50 million in government contracts. She took a step closer to him. I speak 6 languages fluently. I've been personally briefed by the Secretary of Defense 3 times. The President of the United States knows my name. Another step. I've prevented more cyber attacks on American infrastructure than anyone else in the country. The banking app on your phone works because of code I wrote. The power grid that keeps your company running is protected by algorithms I designed. She was directly in front of him now, looking up at his face with eyes that suddenly seemed ancient. So, tell me, Richard, what exactly have you done to earn your place? Richard opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Every achievement in his life suddenly felt small and petty compared to what she'd just described. But his ego wouldn't let him admit defeat. You're lying, he whispered. You're making all of that up. Kendra smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a warm smile. Am I? Richard Blackwood felt his reality cracking like ice under pressure. Everything the girl had said sounded impossible, but the confidence with which she'd said it made him doubt his own perceptions. Number. He shook his head violently. He was being manipulated, gaslit. This was exactly what corporate espionage looked like in the modern age, psychological warfare designed to make him question himself. I don't believe you, he said, his voice growing stronger as the conspiracy theory reasserted itself in his mind. Nobody accomplishes that much by 19. You're reading from a script, probably have an earpiece feeding you lines. He moved closer to Kendra, peering at her ears, looking for hidden technology. Where is it? In your hair, under that hoodie. Agent Torres stepped forward immediately. Back away from her. Now. I'm just looking for the listening device, Richard said, still focused on Kendra. When I find it, this whole charade falls apart. There's no device, Kendra said calmly. There's no charade. There's just you refusing to believe that a young black woman could be smarter than you. It's not about race, Richard exploded. It's about probability. It's about logic. Look at yourself. He gestured wildly at her outfit, her backpack, her general appearance. You look like you raided a thrift store. Your bag is held together with duct tape. If you're really some kind of government genius, where's your security detail? Where are your fancy clothes? Where's your proof? You're looking at my security detail, Kendra said, nodding toward Agent Torres. One guy is protecting America's most valuable cyber expert. I don't need much protection, Kendra said quietly. Most threats don't see me coming. Something about the way she said it made Richard's skin crawl. There was a confidence in her voice that went beyond arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who'd been tested and proven. But Richard's ego couldn't process that reality. "Fine," he said, pulling out his phone. "If you're really who you say you are, you won't mind me documenting this conversation. My lawyers can sort out the truth later." He started recording video, pointing the phone at Kendra's face. "State your name and occupation for the record." "Stop recording." Torres commanded, his hand moving to his belt. "I have a right to record in public spaces," Richard said, still filming. "If she's telling the truth, she has nothing to hide. You don't have the right to record a federal agent or protected personnel," Torres replied. "Delete that video. Now." "Protected personnel." Richard laughed, the sound harsh and hysterical. "She's 19 years old. What's she protected from homework?" That's when Elena Rodriguez stood up from her seat, her face flushed with anger. "That's enough," she said, moving toward Richard. "I've been watching you harass this girl for 30 minutes and I'm done. Miguel, call the captain. This man needs to be restrained." "Call the captain?" Richard spun to face Elena. "I'm not the problem here, they are." He pointed at Kendra and Torres. "They're running some kind of con game and you're all falling for it." "The only con here," Elena said coldly, "is you pretending to be a decent human being." Richard felt cornered, surrounded by hostile faces and conspiracy theories that were growing more elaborate by the minute. Everyone was against him. Everyone was part of the plot. "I want proof," he said, his voice cracking with desperation. Real proof, not stories, not badges that could be fake, not threats from muscle-bound bodyguards. "I want to see what's in that bag." He pointed at Kendra's backpack, which still sat on her tray table. "If you're really protecting government secrets, show me. If you're really some kind of computer genius, prove it." Kendra and Torres exchanged a look that Richard couldn't interpret. "That's classified material," Torres said. "You don't have clearance to view it." Classified Richard's laugh was getting more unhinged. "Classified homework? Classified coloring books." He started moving toward Kendra's seat again, his hand outstretched toward the backpack. "Just a quick look, just to confirm what I already know." "Don't," Kendra said, her voice carrying a warning that made several passengers flinch. But Richard was beyond hearing warnings. His entire worldview was at stake. If he was wrong about this girl, if she really was who she claimed to be, then everything he believed about merit and success and the natural order of things was wrong. He couldn't be wrong. He couldn't be the villain in this story. His fingers grazed the canvas of the backpack. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. Kendra moved like liquid lightning, her hand shooting out to grip Richard's wrist with mechanical precision. The pressure she applied hit nerve clusters that sent shockwaves of pain up his arm, forcing him to his knees. "I said don't," she repeated, her voice now carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Richard gasped, trying to pull his hand back, but her grip was iron. Where had a teenager learned to do that? Why did her movements look so professional, so practiced? "Let go," he wheezed. "You're hurting me." "Good," Kendra said simply. "Maybe pain will teach you what words couldn't." She released him, and he stumbled backward, cradling his wrist and staring at her with new terror. "Did you all see that?" he shouted, looking around the cabin for support. "She assaulted me. She used some kind of martial arts. Call security. Call the air marshal." Agent Torres smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "I am the air marshal," he said quietly. Richard felt the last piece of his confidence crumble. Air marshal. Not just any federal agent, but the air marshal. The one person on the plane specifically responsible for security. And he was protecting the girl Richard had been harassing. "This is impossible," Richard whispered, still rubbing his wrist. "This can't be real." Reality. Kendra said. Settling back into her seat with fluid grace doesn't require your belief to exist. Miguel Santos, who had been watching the entire exchange with growing alarm, finally made the call he'd been dreading. He picked up the cabin interphone and dialed the cockpit. Captain Mitchell, we have a situation in first class that requires your immediate attention. Captain James Mitchell received the call from the cabin crew just as Flight 847 was reaching cruising altitude over the Atlantic. In his 30 years of flying commercial aircraft, he'd dealt with every kind of passenger incident imaginable: drunks, terrorists, medical emergencies, and garden-variety troublemakers. But when Miguel described the situation in first class, the captain felt a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature at 37,000 feet. Say again, Miguel. We have a passenger who has been harassing what appears to be a federal asset under protection of an air marshal. The passenger has attempted to steal classified materials and has made numerous racially charged comments. Captain Mitchell closed his eyes and cursed under his breath. This was exactly the kind of incident that could destroy careers, ground airlines, and trigger federal investigations that lasted for years. Is the asset secure? Yes, sir. Agent Torres has the situation contained for now, but the passenger is escalating. I believe he may need to be physically restrained. I'm coming back. Captain Mitchell handed control to his first officer and made his way to the first-class cabin. What he found there exceeded his worst expectations. A well-dressed businessman was standing in the aisle, his face red with fury and his expensive suit disheveled. He was pointing at a young black woman who sat calmly in her seat, apparently unbothered by the chaos around her. And standing protectively near the young woman was a large Hispanic man who had the unmistakable bearing of federal law enforcement. What's the situation? Captain Mitchell asked Miguel quietly. Passenger in 1A. Richard Blackwood has been harassing Miss Williams for over an hour. He's demanded to see her identification, attempted to steal her belongings, and made several statements that could be considered racially motivated harassment. Captain Mitchell nodded grimly. And the Marshal Agent Torres. He's been trying to de-escalate, but Mr. Blackwood won't listen to reason. The captain approached Richard, who was still gesticulating wildly as he explained his conspiracy theories to anyone who would listen. Mr. Blackwood, I'm Captain Mitchell. I understand we have a problem. Richard spun around, relief flooding his face at the sight of an authority figure who might finally listen to him. Captain, thank God. These people are running some kind of elaborate scam. They're claiming to be federal agents intimidating passengers, probably planning some kind of fraud or worse. Captain Mitchell studied Richard's face, taking in the wild eyes, the desperate expression, the complete conviction in his own righteousness. He'd seen this before. Passengers who became so invested in their own narratives that they lost all connection to reality. Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately. But Captain, that wasn't a request. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You don't understand. I have proof. I recorded them threatening me. He pulled out his phone, fumbling with the video he'd taken earlier. Sir Agent Torres interjected that recording contains images of classified personnel and materials. I need you to delete it immediately. See? Richard turned to the captain triumphantly. They don't want evidence of their scam preserved. Captain Mitchell looked at Agent Torres, who discreetly showed his badge and federal identification. The captain's expression hardened. Mr. Blackwood, you are interfering with federal agents in the performance of their duties. This is a felony offense. Federal agents. Richard's voice cracked. They're not federal agents. Look at them. She's a teenager in a hoodie. He's wearing a polo shirt. Federal agents don't look like that. Federal agents, Captain Mitchell said coldly, look like whatever they need to look like to do their jobs. And you are now officially under federal jurisdiction for interference with their mission. Richard felt the walls closing in around him. This couldn't be happening. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a few phone calls. Captain, I'm Richard Blackwood. I'm the CEO of Data Flow Systems. I have government contracts. I have security clearance. I know people in Washington who can vouch for me. Mr. Blackwood Kendra spoke for the first time since the captain's arrival, her voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the cabin listen. What's your clearance level? The question caught Richard off guard. What your security clearance? What level I have secret clearance for some of our government contracts. Kendra nodded. Secret. That's cute. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a government-issued tablet, powering it up with her thumbprint. The screen displayed a classification level that made Captain Mitchell's eyes widen. Top secret SCI with special access programs, she said calmly. I have clearance levels that most senators don't even know exist. So when I tell you that your behavior has compromised a federal operation, you should probably listen. Richard stared at the tablet, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. That's fake, he said weakly. You can fake anything with Photoshop. Kendra touched the screen, opening an encrypted communication app. Within seconds, she had a video call connected to a secure government facility. Director Kane, she said to the figure on the screen. A stern-faced woman in her 50s appeared sitting in what was obviously a high-security government office. Agent Williams, status report. Minor security compromise, civilian interference with transport protocols. Agent Torres has it contained. Understood. Do you need extraction? Negative. Continuing to Geneva as scheduled. Acknowledged. Kane out. The call ended, leaving the first-class cabin in absolute silence. Richard Blackwood stared at the tablet screen, then at Kendra's face, then at Agent Torres, then at Captain Mitchell. Everyone was looking at him like he was a dangerous animal that needed to be caged. That was the Director of National Intelligence, Captain Mitchell said quietly. The third highest-ranking intelligence official in the United States government. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed into the nearest seat, his face paper white. This is real, he whispered. Very real. Kendra confirmed, powering down the tablet and returning it to her backpack. You're actually... Dr. Kendra Williams, Senior Cyber Defense Architect for the Department of Defense, currently en route to brief NATO allies on critical infrastructure protection. She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes fixed on his face. The person you've been calling a fraud for the last hour is one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the United States. The person you demanded prove her citizenship has personally saved more American lives than most Medal of Honor recipients. Richard's hands were shaking. I didn't know. I couldn't have known. You didn't want to know, Elena Rodriguez interjected from her seat. You saw a young black woman and decided she didn't belong. You never bothered to find out who she actually was. But look at her, Richard said desperately. She looks like what Kendra asked quietly. Richard couldn't finish the sentence. Every word he might say would only dig his grave deeper. Agent Torres stepped forward, pulling a pair of zip-tie restraints from his jacket. Richard Blackwood, you are under arrest for interference with federal agents, attempted theft of classified materials, and harassment of protected personnel. Wait, Richard said, panic setting in. Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I can explain. I made a mistake. Yes, Kendra said, standing up and looking down at him with something that might have been pity. You made several mistakes, and now you're going to pay for all of them. The zip ties bit into Richard Blackwood's wrists as Agent Torres secured them behind his back. The plastic restraints were deceptively simple, but Richard quickly discovered they were impossible to escape from tightening with every movement. This is insane, he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality. I'm a legitimate businessman. I have a merger to complete in Geneva. You can't arrest me for asking questions. You didn't ask questions, Elena Rodriguez said from her seat, still recording everything on her phone. You racially profiled a teenage girl and then tried to steal government property. There's a difference. Captain Mitchell knelt down next to Richard's seat, his expression grave. Mr. Blackwood, I need you to understand the severity of this situation. You didn't just harass another passenger. You interfered with a classified government operation. What operation? Richard demanded. What could possibly be so important about a teenager in a hoodie? Kendra Williams, who had been quietly organizing her materials, looked up from her backpack. Do you really want to know? Yes, Richard said immediately. I deserve to know what I'm being accused of. Kendra exchanged a look with Agent Torres, who nodded slightly. Very well, she said, standing up and facing Richard directly. But understand that what I'm about to tell you is classified information. By hearing it, you become bound by federal secrecy laws. She paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. 3 months ago, intelligence agencies detected a coordinated cyber attack being planned against the global banking system. Not just American banks, but every major financial institution in the world. The attack was designed to trigger a complete collapse of international markets. Richard found himself leaning forward despite his restraints drawn in by her words. The attack vector was sophisticated beyond anything we'd seen before. It used quantum algorithms to break encryption methods that were supposed to be unbreakable for another decade. Traditional cyber defense couldn't stop it. She reached into her backpack and pulled out the leather-bound notebook Richard had seen earlier. So they called me. Called you for what? To design new encryption protocols that could resist quantum attacks, to build firewalls that could adapt faster than the attackers could evolve, to essentially redesign the security architecture of the global financial system. She opened the notebook, revealing pages covered in mathematical equations so complex they looked like alien hieroglyphics. This notebook contains the source code for those new protocols. The algorithms that will protect every bank account, every credit card, every digital transaction in the world. Richard stared at the notebook, his mind reeling. You wrote that every line. But you're 19. Black, female, wearing a hoodie. Kendra's voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. I know. Those characteristics somehow convinced you I couldn't possibly be intelligent. She closed the notebook and held it against her chest. Do you know what happens if these protocols aren't implemented by next Tuesday? Richard shook his head. The attack launches automatically. Every ATM stops working. Every credit card is declined. Every bank transfer fails. The global economy doesn't just crash, it disintegrates. Billions of people lose access to their money overnight. The first-class cabin was dead silent as the implications sank in. The G7 summit in Geneva isn't just a meeting, Kendra continued. It's the last chance to coordinate the implementation of these defenses across all allied nations. If I miss that briefing, if these algorithms don't get deployed in time, then next Tuesday becomes the day civilization as we know it ends. She took a step closer to Richard, her young face carrying the weight of unimaginable responsibility. So when you decided I didn't belong in first class, when you tried to steal my bag, when you interfered with my work, you weren't just being racist, you were threatening global security. Richard felt like he was drowning in ice water. Everything she was saying was so far beyond his understanding, so much bigger than his small world of corporate acquisitions and stock prices. I didn't know, he whispered. Of course you didn't know, Agent Torres said from behind him. That's the point. Dr. Williams works in the shadows because the moment her identity becomes public, she becomes a target for every enemy of the United States. Dr. Williams. Richard looked at Kendra with new eyes. You have a doctorate, 2 of them. Computer science and applied mathematics from MIT. Earned them simultaneously when most kids are getting their driver's licenses. She sat back down in her seat, suddenly looking very tired. I chose to work anonymously because I'm more effective when people underestimate me. When foreign agents are looking for America's top cyber defense expert, they picture a middle-aged white man in a government facility. They don't look twice at a tired black teenager with a backpack. The prejudice that you used against her, Elena added, is exactly what makes her so valuable to national security. Richard felt nauseous. You're saying I helped terrorists by bothering her? You compromised her. Cover interfered with her mission and potentially exposed her identity to hostile surveillance, Agent Torres explained. On a commercial flight with passengers from multiple nations, some of whom may have foreign intelligence connections. Captain Mitchell, who had been listening to the entire exchange, shook his head grimly. Mr. Blackwood, do you understand that we're now required to divert this flight? We can't continue to Geneva with a compromised federal asset on board. Divert. Richard's voice cracked. But my meeting? Your meeting is the least of your problems, the captain replied. We're heading to a secure facility where Dr. Williams can be debriefed and relocated, and you're going to be handed over to federal authorities for interrogation. Interrogation. They need to determine whether you're a foreign agent, a domestic terrorist, or just an incredibly stupid racist, Elena said bluntly. I'm not any of those things, Richard protested. I'm just a businessman. I made a mistake. You made multiple mistakes, Kendra said, pulling out her tablet again. You profiled me based on my race and age. You harassed me publicly. You attempted to steal classified materials. You recorded federal personnel without authorization. And you did all of this while potentially under surveillance by foreign intelligence services. She tapped the screen, pulling up what looked like a passenger manifest. Flight 847 has passengers from 12 different countries. At least 3 of them are from nations with active cyber warfare programs against the United States. Your little scene gave them a perfect opportunity to identify me. Richard felt his world collapsing around him. What does that mean for me? It means, Agent Torres said, checking his watch, that in about 2 hours we'll be landing at a federal facility where you'll be questioned by some very serious people about your motivations, your background, and your connections. I don't have any connections. I'm just a CEO who suddenly developed an intense interest in a teenage girl carrying classified materials, Kendra pointed out. A CEO who refused to accept reasonable explanations and escalated to physical harassment. A CEO who seemed determined to expose information that could compromise national security. She looked at him with what might have been genuine curiosity. Tell me, Richard, how did you know to target me specifically? Why were you so convinced I didn't belong? What made you so certain I was hiding something? Richard's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. You didn't look right. I didn't look right, Kendra repeated slowly. Based on what criteria you know what I mean? No, I don't. Explain it to me. Richard found himself trapped in a conversation where every possible answer would damn him further. You looked out of place. Out of place how different from the other passengers. Different how Richard realized that every word he spoke was being recorded, analyzed, and would likely be used as evidence in whatever legal proceedings were coming, but he also realized that silence would be interpreted as an admission of guilt. You're young, he said finally, and you're... Black Kendra finished for him. You can say it, Richard. You profiled me because I'm a young black woman in a space you think belongs to old white men. She stood up again, her small frame somehow commanding the entire cabin's attention. The irony is that your prejudice is exactly what's been protecting people like you. While you've been judging books by their covers, those books have been working around the clock to keep your comfortable world from falling apart. She gestured to her notebook, her tablet, her worn backpack. Every algorithm in here exists because someone who looks like me decided that someone who looks like you deserves protection, even when you don't extend the same courtesy to us." Richard felt tears starting to form in his eyes as the full scope of his failure became clear. He hadn't just been wrong about one person, he'd been wrong about everything. The Boeing 777 banked sharply to the left as Captain Mitchell executed the emergency diversion order he'd received from air traffic control. The sudden change in direction sent Richard Blackwood sliding in his restraints, the zip ties cutting deeper into his wrists. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but urgent. "We have been directed to make an unscheduled landing due to a security situation. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." Richard felt the plane descending rapidly, his ears popping from the pressure change. Through the small window, he could see they were no longer over the Atlantic Ocean. Below, the landscape was flat and unremarkable, dotted with what looked like military installations. "Where are we going?" he asked Agent Torres, who was securing sensitive materials throughout the cabin. Ramstein Air Base. Torres replied without looking up. "U.S. Air Force facility in Germany. Secure location for federal debriefings." "This is insane," Richard said for what felt like the 100th time. "I'm an American citizen. I have rights. You can't just kidnap me to a military base." Elena Rodriguez, who had been documenting the entire incident on her phone, looked up from her screen. "Actually, they can. Under the Patriot Act, interfering with federal agents during a national security operation suspends most of your normal legal protections." "How do you know that I'm a lawyer?" Elena said simply. "Corporate law, mostly, but I know enough criminal law to recognize when someone is completely screwed." She held up her phone, showing him the screen. "This video has been uploading to cloud storage in real time. Your racist meltdown is already being backed up to servers in 3 different countries. Even if they confiscate my phone, the evidence is preserved." Richard felt a new kind of panic setting in. "You can't post that video. It would destroy my company." "Your company is already destroyed," Elena replied. "Dataflow stock has been suspended pending federal investigation. Your board called an emergency meeting an hour ago and voted unanimously to terminate you. That's impossible. I own controlling shares. Not anymore. Those shares are frozen under federal asset forfeiture laws. Congratulations, you're broke." Dr. Kendra Williams looked up from her tablet where she'd been monitoring news feeds and social media. "It gets worse," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't find Richard's misfortune particularly tragic. "Someone leaked the story to financial media. Dataflow's government contracts are being reviewed for compliance with anti-discrimination policies." She scrolled through several headlines on her screen. Tech, CEO's racist tirade on federal flight. Dataflow systems under investigation for civil rights violations. Billion-dollar company crashes after executive's bigoted meltdown. Richard felt physically sick. This will ruin everything. My employees, my investors, everyone who depends on Dataflow. You should have thought of that before you decided to harass a federal agent," Agent Torres said, checking his service weapon as they prepared for landing. The plane touched down hard on the military runway, the anti-lock brakes squealing as they slowed to taxi speed. Through the windows, Richard could see armored vehicles and personnel in military fatigues surrounding the aircraft. This wasn't a normal airport. This was a fortress. Dr. Williams came a voice over the cabin intercom. "Priority 1 debrief team is standing by. Agent Torres' federal custody transfer is authorized." Kendra began packing her materials with practiced efficiency. "Richard, I want you to understand something before we part ways." She stood over him, her young face serious and sad. "I don't hate you. I feel sorry for you. You've spent so much energy judging people by their appearance that you never learned to see what's actually in front of you." She shouldered her backpack, the worn straps contrasting sharply with the high-tech tablet and classified materials inside. "The world is changing faster than people like you can adapt to. The brightest minds, the most innovative solutions, The most critical breakthroughs are coming from people who don't look like what you expect genius to look like. She paused at his seat, her hand resting briefly on the armrest. Your inability to recognize that isn't just a personal failing. It's a strategic disadvantage that makes you and people like you irrelevant. She walked toward the cabin door where military personnel were waiting to escort her to a secure briefing facility. Good luck, Richard. You're going to need it. As she disappeared through the doorway, Richard realized he would never see her again. The teenager in the hoodie who had outsmarted him, outclassed him, and ultimately outlasted him was walking away to save the world, and he was about to be dragged away in chains for trying to stop her. Agent Torres unlocked Richard from his seat restraints, immediately replacing them with heavier federal custody shackles. Move slowly, Torres instructed. Military police don't have the same patience I do. Richard shuffled toward the cabin door. His expensive suit wrinkled and his face streaked with tears he didn't remember shedding. Elena Rodriguez watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. I hope this was worth it, she called after him. I hope your sense of superiority was worth losing everything. Richard wanted to respond, wanted to defend himself, wanted to somehow regain the dignity that had been stripped away piece by piece over the course of this nightmare flight. But as he stepped off the plane and saw the federal agents waiting for him, he realized that dignity was something he'd lost long before he'd ever met Dr. Kendra Williams. He'd lost it the moment he decided that a person's worth could be measured by the color of their skin. The federal interrogation facility at Ramstein Air Base was designed to be psychologically intimidating. The walls were bare concrete, the lighting was harsh fluorescent, and the only furniture was a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. Richard Blackwood sat in one of those chairs, still wearing his expensive suit but looking like a broken man. His wrists were raw from the restraints, his face was pale from exhaustion, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone whose world view had been shattered. Across from him sat Special Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. She was reviewing a file that seemed impossibly thick for an incident that had only occurred 6 hours earlier. Mr. Blackwood, Agent Chen began, her voice professionally neutral. We need to discuss your behavior on Flight 847. I've already explained everything, Richard said wearily. It was a misunderstanding. I thought she was a fraud. You thought a federal agent was a fraud. I didn't know she was a federal agent. What made you think she was a fraud? Richard shifted uncomfortably. She didn't look like she belonged in first class. Based on what criteria? It was the same question Dr. Williams had asked him, and Richard still didn't have a good answer. She was young, casually dressed. She looked like a student. Dr. Williams is 19 years old and holds 2 PhD degrees from MIT. She was casually dressed because she'd been working for 72 straight hours to prevent a cyber attack on American infrastructure. She looked like a student because, technically, she still is one. She's currently pursuing a 3rd doctorate in quantum cryptography. Agent Chen opened a laptop and turned it toward Richard, showing him a series of photographs. These are pictures from your company's social media accounts over the past 5 years. Company parties, board meetings, promotional events. Can you tell me how many black employees appear in these photos? Richard glanced at the screen and felt his stomach drop. He'd never noticed before, but now that it was pointed out, the absence was glaring. Dataflow employs hundreds of people, he said weakly. According to your HR records, Dataflow employs 847 people total. 17 of them are black. That's approximately 2% of your workforce in an industry where the national average is 8%. Agent Chen scrolled through more images. Furthermore, none of those 17 black employees hold executive or senior management positions. The highest-ranking black employee at Dataflow is a mid-level project coordinator who makes $67,000 per year. We hire based on qualifications, not race. Let's examine your hiring practices. Agent Chen pulled out a stack of documents. Over the past 3 years, Dataflow has received 2,847 resumes from qualified black candidates. Of those you interviewed, 23 and hired 4. That's a hiring rate of 0.14% for black applicants versus 3.7% for white applicants with similar qualifications. Richard felt trapped. Every statistic was like another nail in his coffin. I wasn't involved in day-to-day hiring decisions. No, but you set company culture. And according to several former employees we've interviewed, that culture included regular comments about cultural fit and maintaining team cohesion. Agent Chen opened another file. Lisa Johnson, former software engineer, hired in 2019, left in 2020. Her exit interview mentions being told by management that her natural hair was unprofessional and that she should consider options that better match company standards. I don't remember that specific incident. Marcus Thompson, former data analyst, left Dataflow after 8 months. His supervisor told him he was too aggressive during meetings where he questioned technical decisions. His white colleagues who exhibited identical behavior were praised as passionate advocates. These are just disgruntled employees making accusations. 17 employees, Mr. Blackwood. 17 separate witnesses describing a pattern of racial bias at your company. And that's just the ones we've interviewed so far. Agent Chen closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. Your behavior on Flight 847 wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of prejudice that you've been expressing through business decisions that harm black professionals. Richard felt cornered and defensive. Even if that were true, it doesn't make me a national security threat. Doesn't it? Dr. Williams is one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the United States. Her work has prevented multiple cyber attacks that could have crippled American infrastructure. And you nearly compromised her mission because you couldn't accept that a young black woman might be more intelligent and more important than you. Agent Chen stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the military base beyond. We've been monitoring foreign attempts to identify and target America's cyber defense capabilities. Our enemies know that our best defense comes from unconventional sources. Young minds, diverse perspectives, people who don't fit traditional profiles. She turned back to face Richard. Your prejudice made you exactly the kind of useful idiot that foreign intelligence services recruit. Someone so blinded by racial bias that they can't recognize their own country's assets. I'm not a foreign agent, Richard protested. No, but you're something almost as dangerous, a domestic threat who compromises national security through ignorance and bigotry. Agent Chen returned to her seat and opened a new file. Here's what's going to happen, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to be charged with multiple federal crimes: interference with federal agents, attempted theft of classified materials, and disruption of national security operations. What kind of sentence are we talking about? Based on the severity of the charges and the national security implications, you're looking at 8 to 12 years in federal prison. Richard felt his world collapse completely. 8 years minimum. And that's if you cooperate fully with our investigation into Dataflow's hiring practices and help us understand how deeply embedded racial bias has become in your corporate culture. You're destroying my entire life. Agent Chen's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. Mr. Blackwood, you destroyed your own life the moment you decided that Dr. Williams didn't deserve the same respect you expect for yourself. We're just documenting the consequences of your choices. She closed the files and stood up. A public defender will be assigned to your case. I suggest you use the time before trial to think seriously about the kind of person you want to be when you get out of prison. As she walked toward the door, Richard called after her desperately. What about my company? What about my employees? Agent Chen paused at the threshold. Dataflow will probably survive. Companies usually do when they remove toxic leadership. As for your employees, they'll likely be better off without you. The door closed with a metallic clang, leaving Richard alone in the concrete room with nothing but his thoughts and the devastating realization that his prejudice had cost him everything he'd spent his life building. 6 months later, the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. was packed with media civil rights activists and curious observers who had followed the case of United States versus Richard Blackwood with intense interest. The story had become a symbol of how unconscious bias could escalate into federal crimes, and the trial was being watched as a potential turning point in how the justice system handled cases involving racial profiling and national security. Richard sat at the defendant's table wearing an ill-fitting public defender suit, having lost significant weight during his months in federal detention. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by the hollow-eyed stare of a man who'd lost everything and was still coming to terms with how it had happened. His attorney, Frank Miller, was an overworked public defender who'd been assigned to the case after Richard's assets had been frozen and he could no longer afford private counsel. Your Honor, Prosecutor Janet Williams addressed the court. This case is about more than one man's racist behavior on an airplane. It's about how prejudice can compromise national security and endanger the very people working to protect our country. She turned to face the jury, her voice carrying the weight of conviction. Dr. Kendra Williams is one of the most valuable cyber defense experts in the United States. At 19 years old, she has already prevented multiple attacks on American infrastructure that could have caused billions of dollars in damage and potentially cost lives. The prosecutor gestured toward the witness box, where Dr. Williams sat wearing a professional Navy suit that somehow made her look both older and younger than her years. Dr. Williams was traveling to Geneva on a classified mission to brief NATO allies on cyber defense protocols that would protect the global banking system from a coordinated attack. Her mission was time-sensitive and critical to international security. She pointed at Richard. Mr. Blackwood saw a young black woman in casual clothes and decided she didn't belong in first class. He harassed her for over an hour, attempted to steal classified materials, and created a public scene that potentially compromised her cover and endangered her mission. The prosecutor walked closer to the jury box. The defense will claim this was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken assumptions that got out of hand. But the evidence will show that Mr. Blackwood's behavior was part of a pattern of racial bias that pervaded his business practices and personal interactions. Dr. Williams took the stand with quiet dignity, answering questions in a clear, confident voice that filled the courtroom. Mr. Blackwood demanded to see my identification, accused me of using stolen credit cards, and suggested I was engaged in fraud, she testified. When I refused to submit to his interrogation, he escalated to physical harassment and attempted to forcibly search my belongings. The prosecutor asked her to describe the contents of her backpack. Classified algorithms that protect the American banking system from quantum cyber attacks. Source code that, if compromised, could potentially allow hostile actors to steal billions of dollars and crash the global economy. A murmur went through the courtroom as people realized the scope of what had almost been compromised. Dr. Williams, the prosecutor, continued. How did Mr. Blackwood's actions affect your mission? They required us to divert the flight to a secure facility, delay my briefing by 12 hours, and implement additional security protocols that revealed the existence of our defensive capabilities to potential adversaries. She looked directly at Richard, her expression sad but determined. His prejudice didn't just harm me personally. It potentially compromised international security because he couldn't accept that a young black woman might be protecting his way of life. The defense's case was weak and poorly prepared. Frank Miller, overwhelmed by his caseload and lacking resources, could only offer character witnesses who described Richard as a successful businessman who'd made a terrible mistake. But those character witnesses ended up damaging Richard's case further when cross-examination revealed that none of them could name a single black person they considered a close friend or professional equal. The jury deliberation lasted only 4 hours. We find the defendant guilty on all counts, the foreman announced. Judge Patricia Reeves, a stern woman with 20 years of federal experience, looked down at Richard with undisguised contempt. Mr. Blackwood, your actions represent everything that is wrong with the persistent racism that infects our society. You saw a brilliant young woman and assumed she was a criminal. You saw America's best and brightest defending our nation and tried to tear her down. She consulted her notes. Your prejudice didn't just harm Dr. Williams. It endangered national security, compromised classified operations, and demonstrated a level of ignorance that is incompatible with participation in civilized society. The judge's voice grew harder. I sentence you to 8 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will also pay restitution of $2.3 million to cover the costs of the diverted flight compromise security protocols and additional protective measures required for Dr. Williams. As the bailiff led Richard away in handcuffs, he caught one last glimpse of Dr. Williams in the gallery. She wasn't celebrating his downfall. She looked sad, as if she genuinely regretted that his prejudice had destroyed his life. But she also looked determined, ready to return to the vital work of protecting a country that had just proven it was willing to hold people accountable for the kind of bias that had almost cost her everything. Richard was escorted out of the courtroom and into a transport van that would take him to federal prison. As the van pulled away from the courthouse, he saw protesters holding signs reading, "Justice for Dr. Williams and racism is a crime." For the first time since the flight, Richard began to understand that his actions had consequences that extended far beyond his own life. He had become a symbol of everything that needed to change about how America treated its most valuable citizens. And Dr. Williams had become a symbol of why that change was so desperately needed. 3 years later, Richard Blackwood sat in the common area of the Federal Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland, watching the small television mounted on the wall. His hands, once manicured and soft, were now calloused from kitchen duty and maintenance work. The news anchor was speaking excitedly about a special ceremony at the White House. In recognition of her extraordinary service to national security, President Martinez will award the Presidential Medal of Freedom to Dr. Kendra Williams, the youngest person ever to receive this honor. The camera switched to live footage from the East Room, where Dr. Williams stood next to the president. She was wearing an elegant navy dress, her hair styled professionally, but her smile was the same one Richard remembered from the plane, genuine, humble, and somehow sad. Dr. Williams, the president said, has prevented more cyber attacks on American infrastructure than any other individual in our nation's history. Her innovations in quantum encryption have protected our banking systems, power grids, and communication networks from hostile foreign actors. The president placed the medal around her neck. But perhaps most importantly, Dr. Williams has shown us that genius comes in many forms and that our greatest national assets may not always look like what we expect them to look like. Dr. Williams stepped to the podium, her voice clear and strong. I accept this honor not just for myself, but for every young person who has been underestimated because of their age, their race, or their background. True strength isn't about demanding respect based on your appearance. It's about earning respect through your actions and lifting others up along the way. She paused, looking directly into the camera. To anyone who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere, you belong wherever your talents and dedication can take you. Don't let anyone else's limitations become your own. The audience erupted in applause, but Richard barely heard it. He was remembering the moment on the plane when Dr. Williams had told him he'd made the worst mistake of his life. She'd been right. But watching her receive the nation's highest civilian honor, Richard realized something else. His mistake hadn't just cost him everything. It had also revealed the true character of the person he'd tried to diminish. Dr. Williams had used her moment of triumph not to celebrate his downfall, but to inspire others who might face the same prejudice she'd encountered. She had proven that greatness wasn't about where you came from or what you looked like. It was about what you chose to do with your opportunities. Richard turned away from the television and walked back to his cell. He had 5 more years to serve, and then a lifetime to figure out how to become the kind of person who built others up instead of tearing them down. Dr. Williams had shown him that it was possible. Now he had to find the courage to try. If you've ever been judged by your appearance or witnessed someone else being treated unfairly, share your story in the comments below. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is working harder than anyone to make the world better. Subscribe if you believe that respect should be earned through character, not appearances. And remember, you never know who might be sitting next to you.